Hi, I'm Olivia Westbrook. They didn't just exclude me from speaking at my grandfather's funeral, they literally had security escort me to the back row. My cousins delivered heartfelt eulogies while the family attorney sat quietly, holding the Kaio document that would shatter their carefully crafted reality. What they didn't realize was that Grandpa Richard had seen everything, documented everything, and made the most unexpected decision of his life. Have you ever been cast aside by the very people who should have valued you most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I arrived at Westbrook Manor an hour before the funeral was scheduled to begin. Not because I was eager to subject myself to more of my family's calculated exclusion, but because I needed time to prepare myself emotionally for what would undoubtedly be another exercise in invisibility. The November sky hung heavy over the sprawling estate, gray clouds threatening rain that seemed to mirror the heaviness in my chest. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my shoes as I walked the winding path to the grand house where I'd spent countless summers as a child. Before the rift, before the whispers, before I became the family's uncomfortable truth. Inside the foyer, the scent of lilies was overwhelming, their perfect white blooms arranged in dramatic displays that grandfather would have found ostentatious. Aunt Patricia was directing staff with military precision, her voice carrying across the marble floor. When she spotted me, her smile froze, the greeting dying on her lips. "Olivia, you came." Not a question, but an observation laced with barely concealed displeasure. "Of course I came," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "He was my grandfather, too." She glanced at her clipboard, her perfectly manicured nail running down a list of "as." "You're seated in Section D near the back. The family section is already arranged." The family section. As if I weren't family. As if the same blood didn't run through my veins. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without revealing the hurt that clawed at my throat. I'd expected this, prepared for it, but expectation didn't dull the sting. "I'd like to say a few words during the service," I said, the request leaving my lips before I could reconsider. Grandpa and I were close, especially these last few years. Patricia's eyebrows rose fractionally. "The speakers have been carefully selected and approved by the family council. Brandon, Marcus, and Elizabeth will be delivering the eulogies. The program is already printed." She handed me a glossy memorial program, my name conspicuously absent from any part of it. "I'm sure you understand." The family council. A concept invented by my Uncle Robert after grandfather's health began to decline 3 years ago. A way to consolidate power, to control the narrative, to decide who was family, enough to participate in decisions. I had never received an invitation to these meetings, despite being Richard Westbrook's granddaughter as much as any of them. I took the program and moved toward Section D without another word. What was the point? This battle had been waged long. Before today, when my mother married beneath her station, as grandmother used to say, when she died and left me straddling two worlds, when I chose education over entering the family business. Each decision had slowly erased me from their carefully curated family portrait. As I found my seat in the back row, I noticed an older gentleman watching me from across the room. Henry Blackwell, my grandfather's attorney for over 40 years. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a small nod that seemed heavy with meaning before turning his attention to a leather portfolio in his hands. Strange. In all the family gatherings I'd attended, Henry had never so much as acknowledged my existence. The memorial hall filled quickly with people dressed in expensive black attire, their somber expressions betrayed by the business conversations they couldn't resist having even here, even now. The Westbrook shipping empire didn't pause for death, apparently. I watched my cousins near the front, huddled together in their exclusive grief, occasionally casting glances back at the growing crowd with satisfaction at the turnout. This was as much a business event as a funeral, a show of power, a display of continuity. At precisely 2 p.m., the service began. Uncle Robert took the podium first, his commanding presence silencing the murmuring crowd. My father, Richard Westbrook, built more than a business. He built a legacy that will continue to thrive through generations of Westbrooks who understand the value of family, tradition, and loyalty. The words cut deeper than he could know. Or perhaps he did know. Perhaps that was the point. My cousins followed with their eulogies, each more performative than the last. Brandon spoke of grandfather's business acumen, recounting anecdotes I'd never heard. Marcus praised his philanthropy, citing donations to organizations I knew grandfather had privately criticized. Elizabeth tearfully recalled family vacations I'd never been invited to join. Not one of them mentioned his passion for astronomy, his secret sweet tooth, his habit of reading 3 newspapers every morning while complaining about the declining standards of journalism. They didn't know about his collection of first edition nautical maps hidden in his study, or how he would call me late at night to discuss books we'd both read. They were eulogizing a stranger wearing my grandfather's name. As the service concluded, Robert announced that the family would be receiving condolences in the East Wing before a private interment ceremony. Family only, he emphasized, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, but carefully avoiding my corner. The message was clear. I was not invited to say my final goodbye. I remained seated as people began to file out, unsure of my next move. That's when Henry Blackwell approached, his expression inscrutable. Ms. Westbrook, he said quietly, I believe your grandfather would want you at the reading. The reading? I echoed, confusion momentarily replacing my grief. Of the will. It's scheduled for tomorrow morning in the library, 9 o'clock sharp. He handed me a formal envelope. This is your official notice. Despite what others might suggest, your presence is not optional. It's required. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before I could respond, he was gone, moving through the dispersing crowd with surprising agility for a man of his age. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, finding a single sheet of heavy stationery inside. By explicit instruction of Richard Westbrook, the presence of Olivia Marie Westbrook is mandatory for the reading of his last will and testament. Failure to comply with this directive will result in significant legal consequences for all beneficiaries. I read the words twice, trying to understand their significance. Grandfather had specifically requested my presence, not just allowed it, but demanded it. The knowledge wrapped around my heart like a protective shield. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had wanted me there. After years of exclusion, that small acknowledgement felt monumental. That night, I stayed in the small guest house on the edge of the property, the only accommodation offered to me, and likely only because Henry had intervened. The main house glowed with lights and conversation, the post-funeral gathering continuing. Well into the evening, I could hear laughter occasionally carrying across the gardens, the sound jarring against my own quiet grief. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos of grandfather and me, images no one in that house knew existed. Us at my college graduation, his proud smile a stark contrast to the absence of other family members. A candid shot from last Christmas when I'd visited him secretly after the official family celebration had concluded. His handwritten notes from our discussions about literature, philosophy, and occasionally, the family business he'd built from nothing. My grandfather had been a complicated man. Publicly stern and traditional, privately curious and surprisingly progressive in his thinking. He'd maintained the family facade while nurturing a relationship with me away from judging eyes. Not brave enough to confront the rift directly, but unwilling to sever our connection completely. A text message interrupted my reminiscing. Be prepared for tomorrow. Bring everything he gave you. HB. Henry Blackwell's cryptic message sent a chill down my spine. What did he know that I didn't? I glanced at my suitcase where I'd packed a small wooden box containing letters, notes, and a few small gifts Grandfather had given me over the years. Was this what Henry meant? Or was there something more? I barely slept that night, memories and questions chasing each other through my mind. By the time dawn broke, I had rehearsed a dozen scenarios for what might happen at the reading, none of them particularly comforting. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress, pulling my hair back into a neat bun. Professional, dignified, the armor I'd learned to wear when facing my family. I tucked my wooden box under my arm and walked to the main house just as the morning mist was beginning to lift from the manicured lawns. The library was already crowded when I arrived, family members arranged in a loose semicircle around Henry's makeshift desk. The conversation died as I entered, replaced by pointed silence and stares. Aunt Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Uncle Robert frowned, checking his watch as if my punctuality were somehow offensive. My cousins barely acknowledged me, their attention fixed firmly on the documents Henry was arranging. "Now that everyone is present," Henry began, his voice carrying the weight of formal legal proceedings, "we can commence with the reading of Richard Westbrook's last will and testament." I took the only remaining seat, somewhat apart from the others. No one moved to include me in their circle. No one spoke to me. I was a necessity they had to tolerate. Nothing more. Henry adjusted his glasses and began to read the standard legal preamble, the formal language washing over us in solemn waves. Family members shifted impatiently, eager to get to the portions that would detail their inheritances. The Westbrook fortune was substantial, the shipping company alone worth billions, not to mention the real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and various collections of art and antiquities. Before I proceed to the specific bequests, Henry said, pausing to look directly at me, "Mr. Westbrook has requested that I play a recording." This was unexpected. A murmur ran through the room as Henry produced a small digital recorder from his briefcase. "This was recorded 6 months ago, with myself as witness," he explained, pressing play. My grandfather's voice filled the room, strong and clear despite the illness that had been consuming him. I closed my eyes, letting the familiar cadence wash over me like a blessing. "To my family gathered here today," he began, "I speak to you now not as the head of Westbrook Shipping, but as a man at the end of his journey, reflecting on the wake he leaves behind. For decades, I have watched this family prioritize appearance over substance, tradition over truth, and status over humanity. I have been complicit in this, to my eternal regret." The room had gone completely still. I opened my eyes to see shocked expressions around me, discomfort giving way to alarm as Grandfather continued. "You have systematically excluded my granddaughter, Olivia, from this family, not because she failed to earn her place, but because her mother chose love over obligation. You have perpetuated a division that I, in my weakness, allowed to persist. In doing so, you have revealed more about your characters than about hers." Uncle Robert stood abruptly. "Henry, this is inappropriate. My father was clearly not in his right mind when—" "Mr. Westbrook underwent a complete psychological evaluation the day this recording was made," Henry interrupted smoothly. "The documentation has been filed with the court. He was deemed fully competent. Please allow the recording to continue." Robert sat down, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "What you don't know," my grandfather's voice continued, "is that while you were excluding Olivia from family gatherings, she and I were meeting regularly. While you were making decisions about my company in your family council, Olivia was reviewing quarterly reports with me and offering insights that, frankly, demonstrated more business acumen than the rest of you combined. While you were jockeying for position and favor, she was simply being a granddaughter to an old man who didn't deserve her loyalty." Tears filled my eyes as the weight of his words settled over the room. I hadn't known he felt this way. Our relationship had been our secret, yes, but I never realized he had seen through the family's machinations so clearly. Olivia graduated at the top of her class from Wharton, a fact none of you bothered to acknowledge. She has worked for the past 5 years at Jensen Maritime Consulting, gaining experience that would have been invaluable to Westbrook Shipping had any of you thought to welcome her expertise. Instead, you saw her only as a reminder of what you considered her mother's transgression, marrying someone who worked with his hands rather than his inheritance. My cousins wouldn't meet my eyes now. Elizabeth was staring at her hands, Brandon was looking at the ceiling, and Marcus was glaring at Henry as if this were somehow his fault. Therefore, my grandfather's voice took on a formal tone. I have made decisions about my estate that may surprise you. These decisions reflect not impulsive emotion, but careful consideration of who will best honor what I've built and the values I should have defended more courageously in life. Henry stopped the recording and picked up the formal will document. Now, to the specific bequests. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, each pronouncement shifting the ground beneath the family's feet. My aunt and uncle received modest financial gifts, substantial by normal standards but a fraction of what they had clearly expected. My cousins were granted small percentages of non-controlling shares in subsidiary companies, along with some personal items of sentimental value. The silence grew heavier with each bequest, the realization slowly dawning that the major assets remained unmentioned. When Henry had finished with the minor distributions, he cleared his throat and turned to a separate document. As to Westbrook Shipping Company, all associated real estate holdings, controlling interest in all subsidiary companies, voting rights, and chairmanship of the board. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his expression a mix of expectation and apprehension. These are bequeathed in their entirety to Olivia Marie Westbrook, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this reading. The library erupted in chaos. Aunt Patricia let out a strangled cry that sounded more outraged than grieved. Uncle sobbed. Robert was on his feet, shouting about contesting the will. My cousins stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to hatred. Only Henry remained calm, continuing to read over the commotion as if it were nothing more than a light breeze. Additionally, the family estate, including the main residence and all surrounding properties, art collections, and historical archives, are bequeathed to Olivia Marie Westbrook, with the provision that family members currently residing in these properties may continue to do so for a period not exceeding 6 months from today's date. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening. This had to be a mistake. I had never wanted their money, their company, their house. I had only wanted acknowledgement, inclusion, respect, the basic dignities of family. Henry raised his voice slightly, bringing the room back to attention. There is a final recording. He pressed play once more, and my grandfather's voice cut through the tension like a blade. To those who are now objecting to my decisions, know that this will has been carefully constructed to be incontestable. Any attempt to challenge it will trigger clauses that will further reduce your inheritances to the legal minimum. This is not spite. It is clarity that came too late in life. A pause, then softer. To Olivia. I know this burden comes as a shock. You never sought power or wealth, which is precisely why you should have it. In the hidden safe behind the nautical map of the North Atlantic in my study, you'll find journals documenting every conversation we had about the business, every insight you offered that I implemented quietly, every success that should have had your name attached. You earned this legacy long before I had the courage to publicly acknowledge it. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to contain the sob that threatened to escape. All those late-night discussions, the questions he'd posed that had seemed theoretical, they had been tests, preparations, evaluations, and I hadn't even known. The company needs your vision, not their entitlement. The family needs your compassion, even if they don't deserve it. and I needed to finally do right by you, even if only after I'm gone. The recording ended, leaving a silence so complete I could hear the antique clock ticking in the corner, marking the seconds of this new reality. Henry closed his portfolio and stood. As executor of this estate, I will be available to assist with the transition of assets and responsibilities. My office will provide necessary documentation to all parties within the week. He turned to me. Ms. Westbrook, when you're ready, we should discuss immediate operational concerns for the company. I nodded numbly, still unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. Around me, family members were in various states of shock and anger. Uncle Robert was already on his phone, presumably calling his personal attorney. Aunt Patricia was weeping dramatically into a handkerchief. My cousins huddled together, occasionally shooting venomous glances in my direction. As people began to disperse, Elizabeth approached me, her expression unreadable. Of all my cousins, she had been the least openly hostile over the years, merely distant rather than actively cruel. "He really talked to you about the business?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," I replied simply. "For years." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at her, really looked at her, wondering if she genuinely didn't understand or if she was being deliberately obtuse. "When exactly should I have mentioned it, Elizabeth? At the family gatherings I wasn't invited to? During the holiday celebrations where my presence was barely tolerated? Or perhaps at his funeral, where I was relegated to the back row and denied the opportunity to speak?" She had the grace to look ashamed. "I never agreed with how the family treated you. I just didn't do anything about it." "That's called complicity," I said quietly, "and it's every bit as harmful as active exclusion." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "What will you do now, with all of it?" I glanced around the library, at the leather-bound books my grandfather had loved, at the portrait of him hanging above the fireplace, at the family photographs arranged. Carefully on side tables, photographs I was notably absent from. "I'm going to run the company he built. I'm going to honor his legacy. And I'm going to rebuild this family. Not based on who has the right last name or the right connections, but on who actually embodies the values he wished he'd defended while he was alive." Elizabeth looked skeptical. "After how everyone treated you, you'd still include them?" I thought about it for a moment. Inclusion doesn't mean absence of accountability. Everyone will have the opportunity to be part of what comes next, but on new terms, terms that reflect merit, integrity, and genuine family loyalty. Not the superficial version this family has been practicing. She nodded slowly, then walked away, leaving me alone in the library that was now, apparently, mine. I moved to the window, looking out over the expansive grounds where I'd played as a child, before the divisions became too wide to bridge. The morning sun had burned away the day mist completely now, illuminating the landscape in clear, unforgiving light. I felt a presence beside me and turned to find Henry, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "He wanted to tell you himself," Henry said quietly. "He had planned to announce everything at Christmas, to face the family's reaction while he could still defend you. The cancer progressed too quickly." I nodded, understanding now why our last few conversations had felt so weighted with things unsaid. "Did he know how they would treat me at the funeral?" Henry's expression darkened. "He feared it. That's why he made certain provisions about the will reading, to ensure you couldn't be excluded from this moment, at least." I never wanted their money or power, Henry. I just wanted to be acknowledged as part of his life. He knew that. Henry placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "That's exactly why he trusted you with both." The days following the will reading unfolded like scenes from a movie I never auditioned for. The grand estate, once forbidden territory, was suddenly mine to navigate freely. Every doorway I'd been subtly guided away from, every room I'd been told was private, all now open to me. Yet the inheritance felt less like victory and more like stepping into a labyrinth with no map. I found myself alone in grandfather's study that evening, running my fingers along leather-bound books and mahogany shelves that still held his scent, sandalwood and the faint trace of the mint candies he'd always kept in his pocket. The North Atlantic map hung exactly where it had always been, its weathered edges telling stories of imaginary voyages we'd plotted together during my childhood visits. With trembling hands, I carefully removed it from the wall, revealing the safe he'd mentioned. Not a modern electronic device, but an old-fashioned combination lock, the kind that requires patient listening and careful turns. The combination wasn't difficult for me to guess. 07/22, 1991, my birthday. A date the rest of the family had systematically ignored for nearly 2 decades, yet he had literally sealed it into his most private sanctuary. Inside the safe, I found exactly what he'd promised: 5 leather journals, each meticulously dated and filled with his distinct handwriting. But there was something else. A sealed envelope with "Read First" written across it in bold strokes. I settled into his chair, feeling both like an intruder and rightful heir simultaneously, and broke the seal. "My dearest Olivia," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Henry has done his job, and you now find yourself the reluctant owner of everything I've built. The family will call it theft, manipulation, senility, anything to explain away the simple truth that you were the only one who saw me as a person rather than a resource to be managed." Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to continue reading. "These journals document every conversation we've had about Westbrook shipping since you turned 25. Every insight you offered that I implemented quietly. Every suggestion that saved millions. Every innovation you proposed that kept us competitive while the family council was busy maintaining the status quo. You did all this without title, without recognition, without compensation, simply because you cared about the legacy beyond the fortune it generated." I remembered those conversations, late-night calls that I'd believed were just an old man's ramblings, his way of connecting with the granddaughter who'd been pushed to the margins. I hadn't realized he'd been recording my thoughts, testing my business instincts, evaluating my potential as his successor. "You'll find the company in better shape than the family believes," the letter continued. "They've been shown doctored reports for the past 2 years. Nothing fraudulent, just conservative estimates that disguised our true growth. A precaution I took when I began to suspect that Robert and Patricia were positioning for a power grab should my health fail suddenly." My heart sank. Even at the end, there had been schemes and counterplots swirling around him. What kind of family operates this way? The real numbers, along with access codes to all accounts, are in the blue journal. Trust Henry. He's been loyal for 40 years and will guide you through the transition. Trust Marina in accounting and Jefferson in operations. They've been briefed and are expecting you. Trust your instincts above all else. They've never failed you, even when you didn't recognize their value. The letter continued with practical instructions, contingency plans, and words of encouragement that felt like conversations we should have had in person. He'd planned for everything, except perhaps the weight of isolation I now felt, holding the keys to a kingdom I'd never sought to rule. "Finally," his letter concluded, "remember that power without purpose is just noise." The family lost sight of why we built this company, not for status or wealth alone, but to create something enduring that improves lives. You understand this instinctively. It's why you're reading this letter now instead of any of them. I carefully folded the letter and opened the first journal, losing myself in his detailed accounts of our conversations, his private assessments of my character, his quiet pride in my insights. Hours passed unnoticed until a soft knock interrupted my reading. "Ms. Westbrook?" It was Eliza, the housekeeper who had been with the family for as long as I could remember. She'd always been kind to me, sneaking me extra desserts during childhood. Visits before the family rift widened into a chasm. I've prepared the master suite for you. I blinked in confusion. The master suite? Yes, miss. Mr. Blackwell was quite clear about the arrangements. The main bedroom is to be yours now. Her eyes held a mixture of respect and curiosity. Unless you'd prefer to remain in the guest house for now. The thought of sleeping in grandfather's room felt strange, invasive somehow. I think I'll stay in the guest house tonight, Eliza. But thank you. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course. Change comes at its own pace. She hesitated before adding, It's good to have you home properly, Miss Olivia. Some of us have waited a long time for things to be set right. Her words caught me off guard. Some of you? A small, knowing smile crossed her face. The staff? Sees everything, miss. Mr. Richard wasn't the only one who noticed how you were treated. With that cryptic statement, she turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Ms. Patricia asked me to inform you that the family will be gathering for breakfast at 8 tomorrow. She emphasized that your presence would be appreciated. The slight emphasis told me everything about the nature of this invitation. The power dynamics were shifting, and breakfast would be the first skirmish in what promised to be a prolonged war. I spent most of the night reviewing the journals, absorbing grandfather's insights, strategies, and hopes. By dawn, I felt both better prepared and completely overwhelmed. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress with a single strand of pearls, professional but not ostentatious. Armor for the battle ahead. The dining room fell silent when I entered. At precisely 8 o'clock. Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia, and my 3 cousins were already seated, tension radiating from them like heat. The head of the table, grandfather's place, sat conspicuously empty. Good morning, I said, forcing warmth into my voice as I took a seat halfway down the table, deliberately avoiding the power position that was technically mine to claim. Murmured responses rippled around the table, none particularly enthusiastic. A uniformed server immediately appeared with coffee, pouring it with the practiced precision that spoke of years serving the Westbrook family's formal breakfasts. I trust you slept well? Aunt Patricia asked, her tone suggesting she hoped the opposite. Well enough, thank you, I replied evenly. There was much to process. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. Indeed, about yesterday's surprising developments. We've been discussing as a family. Part of the family, I corrected gently but firmly. He faltered momentarily. Yes, well, we've been discussing options that might better serve everyone's interests moving forward. I'm listening, I said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into my coffee with deliberate slowness. The arrangement outlined in my father's will, while technically legal, doesn't reflect the practical realities of the company, Robert continued, slipping into the patronizing tone he'd perfected over decades in boardrooms. None of us doubt your intelligence, Olivia, but Westbrook Shipping requires experienced leadership with established industry relationships, something that takes years to develop. I took a sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably before responding. You're suggesting I lack the necessary experience to lead the company my grandfather explicitly entrusted to me? Not permanently, Aunt Patricia interjected smoothly. Just until you've had proper mentorship. Robert has developed a transition plan that would allow you to retain ownership while delegating operational control to those with the requisite expertise. In other words, I would be a figurehead while they continued to run everything as before. The same family council that had systematically excluded me would now mentor me indefinitely. An interesting suggestion, I replied, my tone neutral. I assume this transition plan includes detailed financial disclosures of the company's actual performance over the past 2 years, rather than the conservative estimates grandfather had been showing the family council. The reaction was immediate and telling. Robert's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Brandon and Marcus exchanged confused glances. Only Elizabeth kept her expression carefully controlled, watching me with new wariness. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Robert said stiffly. I smiled. "I'm not implying anything, Uncle Robert. I'm stating that before we discuss any transition plans, I'll need complete transparency about the company's current position. Grandfather's journals were quite detailed about certain discrepancies between reported and actual performance. The mention of journals sent a visible ripple of alarm around the table. They hadn't known about his private records, his documented conversations with me, his strategic preparations for this very moment. Journals? Patricia's voice had risen slightly. What journals? Grandfather kept meticulous records, I replied, deliberately vague. I spent most of last night reviewing them. Fascinating reading. He had remarkable insight into people's motivations and behaviors. The breakfast that followed was a masterclass in tense politeness, with conversation limited to weather observations and stilted inquiries about my life in Boston. I answered minimally, watching as they struggled to reconcile their image of me, the easily dismissed peripheral relative, with the woman who now controlled their financial futures. After breakfast, Henry arrived as planned. The family dispersed quickly, undoubtedly to regroup and strategize. Only Elizabeth lingered, watching as Henry and I prepared to leave for the company headquarters. "You're really going through with this," she said. Not a question, but an observation tinged with something like respect. "Did you expect me to hand everything back after one uncomfortable breakfast?" She shook her head. "No, but I didn't expect you to be so prepared. They underestimated you. We all did." I gathered my belongings, considering her words. The advantage of being invisible is that no one watches what you're learning. She nodded slowly. "They're not going to make this easy for you." "I never expected them to," I replied, surprising myself with how calmly I accepted this reality. But then, nothing about being part of this family has ever been easy. The Westbrook shipping headquarters occupied a striking modern building in downtown Boston, glass and steel rising 22 stories against the harbor backdrop. The contrast with the traditional family estate couldn't have been more pronounced. This was grandfather's vision of the future, not a shrine to the past. As Henry and I entered through the executive entrance, I felt the weight of eyes tracking our movement. News travels fast in corporate settings, and by now, everyone from the board members to the mailroom staff would know about the unexpected succession plan. The executive floor was hushed when we stepped off the elevator, conversations pausing mid-sentence as heads turned. The corner office, grandfather's domain, awaited at the end of the corridor, its double doors closed like the entrance to another world. "Marina and Jefferson are waiting inside," Henry murmured as we approached. "Remember what your grandfather wrote. They're allies, not just employees." I nodded, squaring my shoulders before Henry opened the doors to reveal a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Two people rose from the seating area, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, and a tall black man perhaps a decade older, his bearing military precise. "Ms. Westbrook," the woman said, stepping forward with an extended hand. "I'm Marina Volkov, Chief Financial Officer. Your grandfather spoke of you often." "He did?" The surprise in my voice was genuine. Here, too, he had acknowledged me while I remained unaware. "Indeed," Jefferson Carter said, his deep voice carrying warmth as he shook my hand next. Richard was quite strategic about compartmentalizing information. The family council knew one version of Westbrook shipping. Those of us who actually ran daily operations knew another. And it seems only you were privy to his complete vision. I glanced at the imposing desk that had been his command center for decades. "I'm still piecing that vision together myself," Marina nodded sympathetically. "Which is why we're here. We have approximately 2 hours before the emergency board meeting that Robert called this morning." "Emergency board meeting?" I looked to Henry, who appeared unsurprised. "Standard power play," Jefferson explained. They'll motion for a transitional leadership structure, citing company stability and shareholder confidence. They've likely been on the phones all morning, building support. But they can't override grandfather's will, can they? I asked, looking between the three of them. The will controls ownership, Henry explained. But company bylaws govern operations. They're hoping to effectively sandbox you while maintaining the appearance of respecting Richard's wishes. I moved to the windows, watching boats navigate the harbor below, each following established channels, rules of movement designed to prevent collision and chaos. The maritime order seemed an appropriate metaphor for what I now faced. What would grandfather do in this situation? I asked quietly. Marina smiled, the expression transforming her severe features. He'd be prepared for the meeting before anyone knew a meeting was happening. Jefferson nodded in agreement. Richard's first rule: never enter a room without knowing exactly what cards everyone else is holding. Then let's make sure I'm, prepared, I said, turning back to face them. I need to understand exactly what they think they know, what they actually know, and what I know that they don't. The next 90 minutes were a crash course in corporate strategy, Westbrook style. Marina outlined the financial position, significantly stronger than what had been reported to the family council. Jefferson detailed operational strengths and vulnerabilities, including key personnel whose loyalty might be tested during a leadership transition. Henry explained the legal boundaries of my authority and the potential challenges the board might raise. Your grandfather anticipated this moment, Marina said as we concluded our briefing. He left specific instructions for each of us should the family attempt to circumvent his succession plan. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in his familiar handwriting. Inside was a single page containing what appeared to be random notes, except I recognized them immediately as references to our private conversations over the years. Key insights I'd shared about company direction, market trends, operational efficiencies, ideas he'd implemented quietly, documenting my contributions without my knowledge. Below these notations was a simple instruction. Show them who you really are, not who they've decided you must be. As the boardroom filled 30 minutes later, I could feel the carefully constructed narrative taking shape around me. Robert and Patricia had arrived early, speaking in hushed tones with board members, undoubtedly framing the situation to their advantage. My cousins Brandon and Marcus positioned themselves strategically among the company executives, reinforcing their perceived insider status. Elizabeth entered last, taking a seat slightly apart from the family block, her expression unreadable. I chose to sit in grandfather's chair at the head of the table, not out of arrogance but necessity. Symbols matter in corporate governance, and ceding that position would have sent exactly the wrong message. Marina sat to my right, Jefferson to my left, Henry directly across, a formation that wasn't lost on anyone present. Robert called the meeting to order, his tone somber as if presiding over a crisis situation. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, we face an unprecedented transition following my father's unfortunate passing. While his wishes regarding ownership have been clearly established, the operational leadership of Westbrook Shipping requires careful consideration to ensure stability and continued prosperity. Several board members nodded in agreement, exactly as choreographed. Robert continued, outlining concerns about experience gaps and relationship continuity, never directly challenging my capability, but systematically constructing a case for keeping me at arm's length from actual decision-making. I waited, watching the room's dynamics, noting who seemed genuinely concerned versus those simply aligning with perceived power. When Robert finally finished his carefully crafted presentation and proposed a transitional oversight committee that would effectively function as a regency over my inheritance, I allowed the silence to stretch for several long seconds. "Thank you, Uncle Robert, for your thorough assessment," I finally said, my voice calm and measured. "Before we vote on your proposal, I'd like to address a few points that seem relevant to this discussion." I opened the portfolio Marina had prepared, extracting several reports that had never been shared with the board. First, I believe proper governance requires complete transparency. These documents outline Westbrook Shipping's actual performance over the past 2 years, rather than the conservative projections that have been presented in previous meetings. I slid copies across the table, watching as board members began reviewing figures that painted a significantly different picture of the company's position, one of strategic growth rather than cautious maintenance. Second, I'd like to directly address the concern about my experience. While I haven't held a formal title at Westbrook Shipping, my grandfather and I have been in regular consultation about company strategy for the past 5 years. I activated the presentation screen, displaying a timeline of major company decisions alongside dated excerpts from grandfather's journals documenting my input on each. The evidence was irrefutable. While I'd been publicly excluded from the company, I'd been privately integral to its recent successes. The Jensen Maritime expansion strategy implemented last year? My proposal, adopted after I identified market vulnerabilities our competitors had overlooked. The logistics restructuring that reduced costs by 22%? Based on efficiency models I developed while consulting for similar operations. The Asia-Pacific partnership that increased our market share by 17%? Initiated through connections I cultivated during my time at Wharton. With each example, I could see the narrative shifting. Board members were reassessing, executives recalculating their positions. The family's expressions ranged from shock to outrage to, in Elizabeth's case, something approaching reluctant admiration. My grandfather understood something fundamental about leadership succession, I continued, my confidence growing with each word. It isn't passed through bloodlines or boardroom politics. It's earned through vision, understanding, and commitment to something greater than personal ambition. I closed the portfolio, meeting the eyes of each person around the table before continuing. I don't expect blind loyalty. I expect professional judgment. I don't demand your support. I intend to earn it. But I will not accept artificial constraints. On the authority my grandfather explicitly entrusted to me after years of careful consideration. The silence that followed felt weightless, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then Marina spoke, her crisp voice breaking the spell. As CFO, I've prepared a detailed transition plan based on Ms. Westbrook's directives. You'll find it outlines clear accountability structures, specific performance metrics, and transparent reporting mechanisms that should address any legitimate governance concerns. Jefferson followed seamlessly. Operations will continue without disruption. Key client relationships have been briefed on the succession plan. Market response has been cautiously positive, with our stock up 3% since the announcement. One by one, executives began voicing support, not with blind allegiance, but with professional acknowledgement that perhaps Richard Westbrook had known exactly what he was doing after all. The momentum shifted visibly, leaving Robert increasingly isolated as his carefully constructed coalition began to fracture. When the vote finally came, the proposed oversight committee was rejected decisively. Instead, the board approved a standard 90-day review period during which I would function with full authority as CEO, subject only to normal board governance. As the meeting adjourned, I remained seated, watching as people filtered out in small groups, conversations already recalibrating to the new reality. Robert and Patricia left without speaking to me, their rigid postures broadcasting fury and humiliation. Brandon and Marcus followed, equally silent but with confusion now tempering their hostility. Only Elizabeth lingered, approaching me as the room emptied. That was, she seemed to search for the right word, illuminating. I gathered my materials, suddenly exhausted by the performance but careful not to show it. Which part? All of it, but mostly learning that while we were playing family politics, you were actually learning the business. She hesitated, then added, "They won't forgive you for this, you know. For being what they never suspected you could be." I looked up at her, seeing a glimmer of the cousin I might have known in another reality, another family. Their forgiveness isn't what I'm after, Elizabeth. Their respect might be a start, but even that's secondary to honoring what grandfather built. She nodded slowly. And what about me? Where do I fit in your new order? It was a surprisingly vulnerable question from someone who had participated in my exclusion, however passively. That depends, I replied honestly. Are you interested in actually contributing or just maintaining your position? I'm not sure I know the difference anymore, she admitted. But I'd like to learn. It wasn't an alliance, not yet. But it was a beginning. The first fragile bridge across a chasm that had defined our family for too long. As I stood to leave, I caught sight of grandfather's portrait hanging on the boardroom wall. His expression seemed different now, the stern corporate patriarch transformed into something more nuanced, more human. Or perhaps I was the one seeing differently, finally understanding that his legacy wasn't just the shipping empire or the family name, but the quiet preparation for this very moment, when someone who had been systematically erased would step into the light, not seeking revenge, but restoration. The transformation of Westbrook shipping from family fiefdom to modern enterprise began not with grand announcements or dramatic restructuring, but with quiet mornings and attentive listening. Each day for the first month, I arrived at headquarters. Before dawn, spending the solitary hours learning the rhythm of the company my grandfather had built, and that I had unexpectedly inherited. By 7 a.m., I would venture into different departments, introducing myself not as the owner or CEO, but simply as Olivia. I sat with loading dock supervisors over coffee, discussing equipment challenges and staffing concerns. I shadowed route planners, asking questions about efficiency models and weather contingencies. I joined customer service representatives, listening to client calls about shipment delays and documentation requirements. These early morning conversations revealed more than any executive summary could convey. The company wasn't just balance sheets and organizational charts, it was people with institutional knowledge and practical wisdom that had never made it to boardroom presentations. They spoke candidly, many not realizing at first who I was, sharing frustrations and insights that painted a more complex picture than the polished version my family had maintained. "You're different than we expected," commented Rita, a veteran logistics coordinator who had been with the company for 27 years. We were reviewing routing protocols that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, despite significant technological advancements. "Different how?" I asked, genuinely curious about the perception. She hesitated, then spoke with the frankness of someone who had earned the right to honest opinions. "The family, your family, they don't usually ask questions. They make announcements. They don't sit in our cramped break room drinking mediocre coffee. They summon us to meetings with prepared statements and PowerPoint presentations." I smiled, recognizing the accurate assessment of the Westbrook approach to corporate hierarchy. "Well, I've never been very good at being a proper Westbrook." "That might be exactly what this company needs," she replied, sliding a folder across the table. "These are the workflow improvements we proposed 3 years ago. They were shelved because they didn't align with certain family priorities. Maybe you'll see them differently." This pattern repeated itself throughout the organization. Employees cautiously offering long-ignored suggestions, watching to see if I would react with the dismissive efficiency that had characterized the family's management style. Each time I listened, took notes, asked questions, and followed up. Not with vague promises, but with specific actions and clear timelines. By the end of the first month, word had spread throughout the company. The new Westbrook in charge wasn't just a figurehead installed by her grandfather's dying wish. She was present, engaged, and, most surprisingly, interested in perspectives beyond the executive floor. The family, meanwhile, had retreated to strategic silence. Robert and Patricia maintained minimal contact, appearing at required meetings. with cold professionalism that barely masked their resentment. Brandon and Marcus had essentially withdrawn from company operations, focusing instead on the subsidiary ventures they controlled, small kingdoms where they could maintain the illusion of autonomy. Only Elizabeth maintained regular communication, showing up at my office unannounced one afternoon with an unexpected proposition. "I want to help," she said, dispensing with preamble as she took a seat across from me. "Not for show, not to secure my position. I want to actually contribute." I studied her carefully, searching for hidden motives beneath her direct statement. "Why now, Elizabeth? You've been part of this company your entire life. What's changed?" She didn't flinch from the question. "Watching you these past weeks has been illuminating. You're doing everything differently than we were taught, and it's working. People are responding. Projects are advancing. There's an energy I haven't felt here since before grandfather became ill." I waited, sensing there was more. "And," she continued, "I've been reading some of grandfather's personal correspondence, letters he wrote to me that I never fully appreciated until now. He saw potential in me that I wasn't brave enough to claim." "What kind of potential?" "To think beyond family tradition, to question whether the way we've always done things is actually the best way." She leaned forward, a new intensity in her expression. "Did you know I have an engineering degree that I've never used? The family needed me in corporate communications because it was more suitable for a Westbrook woman." This was news to me. I'd always seen Elizabeth as simply an extension of the family's united front, polished, controlled, content with her prescribed role. The revelation of buried ambitions and redirected talents added another layer to my understanding of how the Westbrook legacy had constrained even its favored members. "What would you do if you could choose your role here?" I asked. "Sustainable technologies," she answered without hesitation. "Our fleet modernization is a decade behind our competitors. I've been researching alternative propulsion systems, hybrid models, emissions reduction strategies." But Robert always dismissed it as premature investment in unproven technology. The passion in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a convenient realignment with new power dynamics. This was a long-suppressed voice, finally finding its courage. "Bring me a proposal," I said. "Not a presentation, not a family discussion, a proper business case with research, projections, implementation timelines. Show me what you've been seeing all this time." The surprise on her face quickly gave way to determination. "I'll have it to you by the end of the week." As she turned to leave, I added, "Elizabeth, this isn't about choosing sides in a family dispute. This is about building something better than what came before." She paused at the door. "Maybe those are finally the same thing." Her proposal arrived 3 days later, not a hastily assembled presentation, but a comprehensive analysis that must have been years in the development. Reading through it, I recognized the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized grandfather's approach, combined with forward-thinking strategies that the family council would have reflexively rejected. I approved the creation of a fleet modernization division the following Monday, with Elizabeth as its director. The announcement sent ripples through both the company and the family, the first visible indication that the power structure was fundamentally changing, not just shifting between familiar faces. That weekend, I finally moved my belongings from the guest house to the main residence at Westbrook Manor. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, but a practical necessity. The constant commute between the property and headquarters was wearing me down. And I needed the home office grandfather had used to manage early morning communications with international partners. Eliza, the housekeeper, helped me settle into spaces that still felt more like a museum than a home. "Your grandfather would be pleased," she commented as she arranged my books on shelves that had previously held leather-bound first editions chosen more for appearance than content. "He always said this house needed youth again, not just visits, but someone who would make it live." "Did he know how lonely it would feel?" I asked, the question escaping before I could filter it. Eliza's expression softened. He knew exactly how lonely power feels, Miss Olivia. It's why he worked so hard to prepare you without burdening you. He hoped you'd find a better balance than he managed. I thought about this as I finally entered the master suite that night, the private domain I'd been avoiding since inheriting the property. The room was exactly as he'd left it, preserved with the same careful attention that characterized everything in the Westbrook world. Photographs on the dresser caught my attention, familiar family groupings, the standard portraits that graced the public spaces downstairs. But there, partially hidden behind the others, was a frame I'd never seen before. I lifted it carefully, my breath catching as I recognized myself at perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sitting on grandfather's lap in his study, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. The spontaneous joy captured in the image stood in stark contrast to the formal portraits that defined the family's public face. I placed it on the bedside table, a small act of reclamation in a house built on carefully maintained appearances. That night, I slept soundly in the heart of a home that had long denied me welcome, finding unexpected peace in claiming space that was rightfully mine. The second month brought the first real test of my leadership beyond the family dynamics. A major logistics failure in our Asian shipping routes threatened timely delivery for several key clients, potentially triggering penalty clauses that would cost millions. The crisis erupted on a Wednesday afternoon, notifications cascading through the organization's alert systems like dominoes falling in rapid succession. Within an hour, I had assembled a response team in the main conference room, not just executives, but operational specialists who understood the practical complexities better than anyone with a corner office. The screens displayed real-time tracking data, weather patterns, and alternative routing options as we assessed the situation. We have 3 primary options, Jefferson explained, pointing to the main display. We can redirect vessels from our European routes to cover the critical Asian deliveries, but that creates secondary delays for European clients. We can charter emergency capacity from competitors at premium rates to maintain all schedules. Or, we can prioritize certain deliveries based on contract penalties and client relationships, minimizing financial impact while acknowledging some deliveries will be late. The room divided along predictable lines, financial officers advocating for the option that protected the bottom line, sales executives pushing to maintain all client relationships regardless of cost, operations specialists calculating the logistical feasibility of each scenario. In the past, such decisions would have been made with a single priority in mind, protecting the family's financial interests above all else. But I saw a different calculation, one that balanced immediate costs against long-term consequences, that considered relationships as valuable as quarterly profits. We'll implement a hybrid approach, I decided after listening to all perspectives. Charter emergency capacity for our top-tier clients with the most significant contract penalties. Redirect available resources to cover secondary priorities. And most importantly, initiate transparent communication with all affected clients immediately. Not just notifications of delays, but detailed explanations of our response and regular updates as the situation evolves. Marina frowned slightly. The communication strategy exposes our vulnerability. The Westbrook approach has always been to manage information tightly until resolution is complete. The Westbrook approach is evolving, I replied firmly. In an age of global tracking and instant communication, clients know there's a problem before we even finish our internal meetings. Our value isn't in presenting an illusion of perfection. It's in demonstrating exceptional problem-solving when inevitable challenges arise. The crisis response team mobilized immediately, implementing the strategy with a level of cross-departmental coordination that would have been unthinkable under the previous siloed management structure. I remained in the office through the night, moving between teams to remove obstacles, authorize resources, and maintain focus on the integrated response rather than departmental priorities. By morning, we had contained the worst potential impacts. By the end of the week, we had not only resolved the immediate crisis but implemented new protocols to prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future. Most surprisingly, the transparent communication strategy had yielded unexpected benefits. Several clients reached out to express appreciation for the forthright approach, strengthening relationships that had been maintained through formal correctness, rather than genuine partnership. The successful crisis management shifted perceptions both within the company and among industry observers. Whispers about the Westbrook Heir gave way to substantive discussions about Olivia's leadership style. The distinction wasn't just semantic, it represented recognition of personal capability apart from family legacy. This shift became tangible during the quarterly board meeting in my third month as CEO. The same room that had hosted attempts to constrain my authority now featured board members bringing proposals directly to me rather than routing them through Robert's remaining allies. The power dynamics had realigned not through dramatic confrontation, but through demonstrated competence and consistent results. Robert, however, had not accepted the new reality. As the meeting concluded, he approached me with the superficial pleasantness that always preceded his most calculated moves. "The family will be gathering at the Cape House this weekend," he announced, as if extending an invitation rather than issuing a summons. "Patricia feels it's important to maintain certain traditions despite recent changes. Your presence would be appropriate." The Cape House, the family's summer compound where annual strategy retreats had traditionally been held away from corporate headquarters. A private domain where the family council had made decisions that would later be presented as fait accompli to the board and executives. The location was deliberately chosen, neutral territory where Robert might reassert influence beyond the now unreceptive corporate environment. "Thank you for the invitation," I replied carefully. "However, I've committed to hosting our international partners for their annual review. Please give Patricia my regrets." His expression hardened slightly. "These are long-standing family obligations, Olivia. Your grandfather understood the importance of maintaining certain appearances. My grandfather understood the importance of prioritizing relationships that build the company's future," I countered. "The Asian delegation has traveled specifically to meet the new leadership. Canceling would communicate exactly the wrong message about our commitment to those partnerships." We both recognized the exchange for what it was. Not a scheduling conflict, but a declaration of independence from the family's traditional control mechanisms. Robert's tight smile acknowledged the rebuff without accepting defeat. "Another time, then. The family discussions will proceed regardless." "I'm sure they will," I agreed pleasantly, "and I look forward to hearing any constructive insights that emerge." As he walked away, Marina appeared at my side. "The family council losing its grip on the crown jewel," she observed quietly. "A significant departure from tradition. Perhaps it's time to distinguish between traditions that built this company and habits that have been limiting its potential," I replied. That weekend, while Robert and Patricia held court at the Cape House with their diminishing circle of influence, I hosted the international partners at Westbrook Manor, breaking yet another tradition by bringing business associates into the family residence rather than maintaining the careful separation between personal and professional domains that had characterized my grandfather's era. The delegation from Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo included both longtime partners and newer connections critical to our expansion strategy. They arrived with the cautious curiosity of those who had dealt with Westbrook shipping for decades, but now faced an unfamiliar figure at its helm. Rather than the formal dinner at an exclusive restaurant that would have been the family's approach, I arranged for a more personal welcome. A reception in the gardens followed by dinner in the main dining room, where generations of Westbrooks had entertained political figures and industry titans, but rarely business partners considered too operational for such intimate settings. "Your grandfather spoke often of his granddaughter with the fresh perspective," Mr. Tanaka, our longest-standing Japanese partner, commented as we toured the property's grounds. "But he never mentioned it was you. We assumed he referred to one. Of your cousins who frequently accompanied him on Asian visits. My grandfather compartmentalized his life quite effectively, I acknowledged. Different people knew different versions of his thinking. Mr. Tanaka nodded thoughtfully. A common practice among those who build empires. They reveal themselves, in portions, never the complete picture to any one person. He paused by a Japanese maple my grandfather had imported decades earlier. This tree was a gift from my father to yours. It has grown well here, adapted to soil very different from its origin. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it carried wisdom I appreciated. Some things thrive precisely because they grow in unexpected places, I replied. He smiled, approval evident in his expression. Your grandfather believed in evolution, Ms. Westbrook. Not radical revolution, but persistent adaptation. I see now why he chose as he did. The evening progressed with a natural warmth that belied the significant business discussions woven throughout. By the time coffee was served in the library, we had covered everything from expansion strategies to technological investments to succession planning within our respective organizations. The partners left with renewed confidence in Westbrook, shipping's direction and, more importantly, in its leadership. As the last cars departed, I found myself alone in the grand foyer, the house settling into night silence around me. For the first time since inheriting this unexpected life, I felt not like an imposter maintaining appearances, but like the rightful steward of something valuable and worth preserving, albeit in evolved form. Elizabeth arrived early the following morning, expression tense as she joined me for coffee in the sunroom overlooking the eastern gardens. I thought you should know what happened at the Cape, she said without preamble. Robert is pushing for more aggressive measures. He's convinced several family members with ownership stakes in subsidiary companies to threaten withdrawal from shared services agreements unless certain structural adjustments are made to the parent company governance. I absorbed this information calmly, having anticipated some version of this countermove. Let me guess. These structural adjustments would effectively restore the family council's authority over major decisions. She nodded. With you as CEO in title, but with expanded oversight requirements that would essentially require family approval for any significant initiative. And the board? Does he believe he has support there? He's working on it. Several members have long-standing personal relationships with Robert and Patricia. They're uncomfortable with how quickly things are changing. I considered this challenge thoughtfully, remembering grandfather's journals, particularly his observations about the difference between power and influence. Power could be assigned through titles and organizational charts. Influence had to be earned through results and relationships. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. It couldn't have been easy to break ranks like this. Elizabeth's expression shifted, a new resolve evident in her posture. I'm not breaking ranks, Olivia. I'm choosing sides. There's a difference. She hesitated before adding, the fleet modernization proposal you approved? I submitted versions of it 3 times over the past 5 years. Each time, Robert buried it because it would have reduced his control over operational decisions. Working directly with you these past weeks has shown me what's possible when leadership prioritizes progress over power preservation. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. This wasn't just about claiming my inheritance or proving my capability. It was about liberating the potential that had been systematically constrained by a family structure more concerned with control than innovation. We'll need to address Robert's coalition directly, I decided. Not through proxy battles or behind-the-scenes maneuvering, but with transparent assessment of what's actually best for the company. Elizabeth nodded, relief evident in her expression. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Later that week, I called an expanded leadership meeting, not just executives and board members, but division directors, regional managers, and key operational leaders. People who rarely had direct voice in strategic discussions, but whose practical knowledge was essential to actual implementation. The unusual format generated speculation throughout the organization. When participants arrived to find the traditional boardroom seating replaced by collaborative workspaces organized around specific business functions, the message was clear. This would not be a typical Westbrook corporate event. "Welcome to the first Westbrook Strategic Integration Summit," I began once everyone had settled. "Today isn't about presentations or pronouncements. It's about honest assessment of where we are, where we need to go, and how we'll get there together." I could see Robert and his allies at the back of the room, expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. They had come expecting another venue for their power play, only to find themselves participants in a completely different conversation. For too long, this company has operated in silos: family interests, board governance, executive management, and operational implementation, each functioning as separate layers with limited integration. The result has been competing priorities, redundant efforts, and missed opportunities. The room remained silent, the truth of this assessment too evident to dispute despite its break from traditional corporate politeness. Over the next 2 days, we'll be working in cross-functional teams to address our most significant challenges and opportunities. Every perspective is valuable. Every insight matters. There are no predetermined outcomes, only the shared goal of building a stronger, more adaptive organization. As people moved to their assigned groups, I watched Robert's calculating expression. He had expected confrontation, a direct power struggle he could frame as the impulsive overreach of an inexperienced heir. Instead, he faced something far more difficult to counter: inclusive leadership that elevated substance over status and results over rank. By dismantling the traditional hierarchy that had protected his influence, I had changed the nature of the game itself. In this new landscape, value would be determined by contribution rather than position, a reality for which he was fundamentally unprepared. The summit continued for 2 full days, generating energy and ideas that transcended the initial power struggle that had prompted it. Teams presented findings, challenged assumptions, and developed integrated strategies that bridged previously disconnected parts of the organization. Robert and his allies found themselves increasingly isolated, not through exclusion, but through the growing irrelevance of their position, as others embraced a more collaborative approach. On the final afternoon, as the full group reconvened, to summarize outcomes and next steps, I noticed something surprising. Many participants who had arrived as neutral observers or even skeptics were now actively championing the new direction. Not out of loyalty to me personally, but from recognition that this approach unlocked potential they had long seen but been unable to activate. "This isn't the end of a process," I concluded as the session drew to a close. "It's the beginning of a new operating model, one that honors our heritage while embracing our future." The strength of Westbrook Shipping has always been our ability to adapt while maintaining our core values of excellence, integrity, and forward vision. As people dispersed, energized, and focused on their implementation responsibilities, Robert approached me directly for the first time since the summit began. "Impressive theater," he said, his tone balanced between acknowledgement and dismissal. "But sustainable businesses aren't built on workshops and good feelings. They require clear authority and decisive leadership." I met his gaze steadily. "They require leaders who recognize that authority isn't the same as wisdom, Uncle Robert. And that decisions improve when they incorporate diverse perspectives rather than defending predetermined positions." "The family won't accept this direction," he warned, the threat implicit but clear. "They don't need to accept it," I replied, calmly. "They only need to recognize it's happening with or without their blessing. The question is whether they want to contribute to our success or simply observe it from an increasingly distant position." As he turned to leave, I added, "Grandfather saw the future more clearly than any of us realized. He understood that adaptation isn't weakness, it's survival. Perhaps it's time to consider that his choice wasn't a rejection of tradition, but its evolution into something that can thrive in a changing world. Whether my words penetrated his certainty remained to be seen. But watching him walk away, I recognized a fundamental truth. I no longer needed his approval or acceptance. The path forward was clear not because I had defeated opposition, but because I had found purpose greater than the power struggle that had defined my family for generations. That evening, I stood alone in grandfather's study, now my study, watching darkness settle over the estate grounds. The weight of responsibility remained, but it no longer felt like a burden imposed by circumstance. It had become a purpose, embraced by choice. On the desk before me lay the journals that had guided my first months of leadership. I closed the last volume, recognizing that while grandfather's wisdom had been invaluable, the time had come to chart my own course. Not in rejection of his legacy, but as its natural evolution, just as Mr. Tanaka had observed about the Japanese maple, thriving precisely because it grew in unexpected soil. 6 months into my unexpected role as CEO of Westbrook Shipping, the autumn winds brought change in more ways than one. Leaves blazed golden across the estate grounds as I hosted the company's first-ever Future Forward Conference, an innovation summit bringing together employees from every level of the organization, alongside industry partners, technology experts, and even select competitors. The grand ballroom of Westbrook Manor, once reserved exclusively for family celebrations and carefully curated social events, now hummed with collaborative energy as cross-functional teams presented breakthrough initiatives that would have been unthinkable under the previous regime. The traditional family portraits lining the walls seemed to watch with mixed expressions as their domain was transformed into a laboratory of ideas. "Your grandfather would barely recognize the place," Henry commented as we observed the activity from a quiet corner, though I suspect he'd approve of the transformation. "Sometimes I wonder," I admitted. "He built such careful structures, maintained such rigid boundaries between family and business, private and public. This level of openness might have horrified him." Henry smiled, the expression softening his typically formal demeanor. Richard Westbrook was many things, but most fundamentally he was adaptive. He recognized changing tides before others even felt the breeze. "Why do you think he chose you as his successor when you represented everything the family had rejected?" He saw the future required a different approach than the one that had built the past. His words settled around me like a reassurance I hadn't realized I needed. The past months had brought remarkable progress. Operational efficiencies improved by 22%. Employee retention increased across all divisions, and our stock value had risen steadily despite initial market uncertainty about the leadership transition. Yet, beneath these measurable successes, I still occasionally questioned whether I was honoring or dismantling my grandfather's legacy. As the day progressed, I circulated through the presentations, asking questions and offering encouragement. The shipping industry was traditionally conservative, change-resistant by nature given the massive capital investments and long-term planning horizons involved. Yet here were Westbrook teams proposing sustainable fuel alternatives, AI-driven, logistics optimization, and community engagement initiatives that redefined our relationship with port cities around the world. Elizabeth's fleet modernization team had expanded beyond its initial mandate, now partnering with a Norwegian renewable energy startup to develop hybrid propulsion systems that could potentially reduce our carbon footprint by 40% within 5 years. Her presentation combined technical expertise with strategic vision, demonstrating a leadership quality that had been suppressed beneath years of family-imposed limitations. "We're not just upgrading vessels," she explained to an attentive audience. "We're reimagining what maritime commerce can be in an era of climate consciousness and resource constraints. The companies that lead this transition won't just secure regulatory compliance, they'll define the industry's future." I watched, with quiet pride, as the cousin who had once maintained careful distance now confidently advocated for transformative change. Elizabeth had become an unexpected ally, her evolution from family soldier to innovative leader mirroring the broader organizational shift underway. As the afternoon sessions concluded, I noticed a familiar figure entering through the main doors. Uncle Robert, immaculately dressed as always, but somehow diminished compared to the commanding presence he'd maintained throughout my childhood. He hadn't attended a company event since the strategic summit 3 months earlier, preferring to exercise what influence remained through proxies and back channels. His appearance now, particularly at an event so emblematic of the new direction, suggested purpose rather than reconciliation. I excused myself from a conversation with research partners and approached him directly, determined to control the engagement rather than react to whatever agenda he'd brought. "Uncle Robert, this is an unexpected pleasure," I greeted him with professional warmth. "I'm glad you could see the innovation initiatives firsthand." His gaze swept the room, taking in the collaborative workspaces, interactive technology displays, and diverse participants engaged in animated discussion. "Quite a departure from traditional operations," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Evolution rarely resembles its starting point," I replied. "Would you like a tour of the specific projects? Several have implications for the subsidiary ventures you're still overseeing." A flicker of surprise crossed his features, perhaps at the absence of defensiveness he'd anticipated, or the implicit acknowledgement of his continued role within the broader organization. "Actually, I came to deliver something in person. It seemed appropriate given the circumstances." He withdrew an envelope from his inside pocket, the heavy cream stationery bearing the distinctive Westbrook family crest. "The Family Council met yesterday at Patricia's insistence. This represents our formal response to the directional changes of recent months." I accepted the envelope without opening it, maintaining eye contact. I appreciate the courtesy of personal delivery. I hope the response reflects thoughtful consideration rather than reflexive resistance. "The family has traditions spanning generations, Olivia. Change may be inevitable, but its pace and nature require careful stewardship." "Indeed they do," I agreed. "Which is why evolution that comes too late can be as damaging as change that comes too quickly. Grandfather understood that balance better than most." Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father made many sound decisions throughout his life. The jury remains out on whether his final one belongs in that category." Before I could respond, Elizabeth approached, tablet in hand. "Olivia, the Singapore team is ready for your feedback on their integration proposal." She stopped short upon seeing Robert, professional composure momentarily wavering. "Uncle Robert, I didn't realize you were attending today." "Just briefly," he replied, his tone cooling several degrees. "I see you've found your place in the new regime." Elizabeth straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I've found my voice, which isn't quite the same thing. The Fleet Modernization Division has already generated substantial efficiency improvements and positive industry recognition." "So I've heard," he acknowledged stiffly. "Patricia sends her regards." The subtle reminder of family alliances and divisions hung between us momentarily, before Elizabeth nodded. "Please return them. And let her know our sustainability initiatives have attracted attention from the Maritime Environmental Partnership. They've expressed interest in featuring Westbrook in their annual report." It was a small moment, but significant. Elizabeth, identifying with the company's new direction rather than family loyalty, prioritizing organizational achievement over personal relationships. The shift wasn't lost on Robert, whose expression revealed brief calculation before settling back into practiced neutrality. "I won't keep you from your responsibilities," he said, gesturing toward the crowded room. "The envelope contains matters for your consideration when time permits." With a perfunctory nod to us both, he departed as deliberately as he had arrived, a representative of fading tradition amidst accelerating change. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, returning. my attention to the innovation presentations that represented our future, rather than the family politics that anchored us to the past. The envelope remained unopened until late that evening, after the last guest had departed and the estate had settled into nocturnal quiet. I sat in grandfather's study, now unquestionably mine, having finally replaced his furnishings with pieces that reflected my own aesthetic while honoring the room's heritage. The heavy oak desk remained, but now held my laptop alongside his antique globe. The leather chairs had given way to more modern seating that encouraged conversation rather than formal distance. The family council's communication was predictably formal, opening with flowery references to legacy and tradition before arriving at its substance. A proposed compromise that would preserve my position as CEO while reinstating certain advisory functions for the family council regarding strategic direction and key appointments. Beneath the diplomatic language lay a simple reality: a rearguard action to salvage influence without directly challenging authority that had now been firmly established. 6 months earlier, such a proposal might have seemed reasonable, even generous. Now it read as a fundamental misunderstanding of the transformation underway, an attempt to graft old power structures onto an organization that had evolved beyond them. I set the document aside without immediate response, turning instead to the quarterly performance reports Marina had prepared. The numbers told a compelling story, not just financial growth, though that was substantial, but operational metrics that demonstrated increasing organizational health. Employee engagement scores had risen 34% since the leadership transition. Innovation submissions from staff had quadrupled. Client satisfaction ratings showed double-digit improvement across all service categories. These weren't simply favorable statistics. They were validation of a leadership approach that prioritized inclusive decision-making over hierarchical control. The company wasn't succeeding despite the dismantling of family governance. It was thriving because of it. As I considered how to respond to the family council's overture, my phone chimed with an incoming message: Elizabeth, sharing press coverage of the day's Innovation Summit. The industry publication had featured our renewable energy initiatives prominently, describing Westbrook Shipping as reinventing itself under next-generation leadership and setting new standards for an industry traditionally resistant to change. The timing felt serendipitous, providing external confirmation of what internal metrics already demonstrated. I composed a brief response to Elizabeth, commending her team's contribution to this recognition, then turned my attention back to the family council's proposal. My reply would need to be respectful but unequivocal. The path forward wasn't about rejection of family or tradition, but about distinguishing between the values that had built the company and the structures that had begun to constrain its potential. Grandfather had recognized this distinction in his final decisions. Now my response needed to reinforce that vision while offering meaningful engagement for family members genuinely interested in the company's future. The following morning, I asked Henry to arrange a gathering different from any the family had previously conducted. Not a formal council meeting at the Cape House or a corporate presentation at headquarters, but a working session at the shipyard where the company had begun nearly a century earlier. The location was deliberate, connecting our origins with our future while removing discussions from the power-laden environments that typically hosted family business. An unconventional choice, Henry observed as we finalized arrangements. The family rarely visits operational sites. Precisely the point, I replied. It's difficult to make decisions about shipping from boardrooms and vacation compounds. I want them to see the reality of what we're building, not just quarterly reports and strategic summaries. The invitation specified business casual attire, another departure from the formal dress typically required for family functions, and mentioned that shipyard employees would be conducting tours before our discussions began. These weren't arbitrary details but calculated choices to shift the dynamic from family hierarchy to organizational reality. When the day arrived 2 weeks later, I reached the shipyard early, spending time with the crew supervisors and project managers who would be guiding family members through their operations. These weren't carefully scripted corporate presentations, but authentic conversations with the people who translated strategic decisions into practical outcomes. Just be yourselves, I encouraged the nervous maintenance supervisor who had never interacted with the Westbrook family despite 30 years of service. You know this operation better than any of us. Your perspective matters. Family members arrived in small groups, their reactions revealing their relationships to the company they technically owned, but rarely engaged with directly. Patricia appeared visibly uncomfortable in the industrial setting, maintaining careful distance from equipment and workers. Cousins Brandon and Marcus moved with the artificial confidence of those determined to appear knowledgeable in unfamiliar territory. Several aunts, uncles, and more distant relatives who held smaller ownership stakes observed with curious detachment, as if touring a museum exhibition rather than a living enterprise. Only Elizabeth navigated the environment with genuine engagement, asking informed questions and connecting with employees she had clearly interacted with previously through her modernization initiatives. The contrast between her integration and the others' separation visually represented the broader organizational dynamics at play. Robert arrived last, his tailored casual attire somehow still projecting boardroom formality. He surveyed the gathering, with the calculated assessment of a strategist evaluating battlefield conditions, noting who engaged where and how as family members were distributed among employee-led tour groups. I approached him directly, maintaining the initiative that had defined our interactions since taking control. I thought you might appreciate seeing the prototype hybrid propulsion system Elizabeth's team has been developing. The engineering group has prepared a special demonstration. The suggestion was strategically designed, acknowledging his technical background while highlighting innovation he had previously dismissed, all through the accomplishments of a family member who had realigned her loyalty. His momentary hesitation revealed the effectiveness of this multi-layered message before he nodded agreement. I'm curious to see what practical application has emerged from theoretical concepts, he replied, the slight emphasis revealing his continued skepticism while accepting the invitation. As family members dispersed with their guides, I observed the interactions with careful attention. Some remained detached, maintaining the physical and psychological distance of owners distinct from operations. Others showed surprising engagement, asking thoughtful questions and absorbing information with genuine interest. The divisions weren't strictly generational or based on family branch, but seemed to reflect individual willingness to reconsider established perspectives. We reconvened, 2 hours later in a converted warehouse space, now serving as the shipyard's innovation center. Instead of a formal conference setup, the space featured collaborative workstations, interactive technology displays, and shipyard artifacts that connected historical accomplishments with future possibilities. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked active construction docks where next-generation vessels were taking shape, visible reminders of the tangible outcomes of strategic decisions. Thank you for experiencing Westbrook shipping beyond balance sheets and board presentations today. I began once everyone had settled into the casual seating arrangement. Before we discuss the family council's proposal, I wanted to establish shared context for our conversation. Patricia shifted uncomfortably, clearly displeased by the public setting for what she had anticipated would be private negotiations. This seems an unusual venue for discussing family governance matters, she noted, her tone suggesting impropriety rather than merely unconventional approach. Family governance of a shipping company should be grounded in understanding the shipping business, I replied evenly. Decisions made in isolation from operational realities have been a fundamental weakness in our previous approach. Robert leaned forward slightly. No one disputes the value of operational knowledge. The question is one of appropriate governance structure and preservation of family interests that span generations. Precisely, I agreed, surprising him with apparent concurrence. Which is why today isn't about rejecting family involvement, but redefining it for greater effectiveness. The council's proposal suggests advisory functions that essentially recreate previous control mechanisms. I'm proposing something different, meaningful engagement that connects family members' actual expertise with organizational needs. I activated the main display screen, revealing a structural proposal quite different from either the previous family council or their suggested compromise. Instead of a single governing body with broad oversight, the model showed integrated connection, points between family members with relevant skills and corresponding organizational functions. Elizabeth's leadership of fleet modernization demonstrates what's possible when family members contribute through direct engagement rather than distant oversight, I continued. Brandon's background in international finance could provide valuable perspective to our Global Investment Committee. Marcus's experience with regulatory compliance would strengthen our governance protocols if applied through active participation rather than approval authority. The proposal continued with specific roles for interested family members based on genuine qualifications rather than familial position. A fundamental shift from entitlement to contribution that honored legitimate expertise while eliminating governance based solely on last name. This approach preserves family connection to the company's direction, while ensuring decisions are made by those with relevant knowledge and direct responsibility for outcomes, I explained. It distinguishes between ownership rights, which remain unchanged, and operational control, which should be earned through demonstrated capability. The silence that followed wasn't simply processing time, but a collective recognition of the paradigm shift being proposed. This wasn't a negotiated compromise between old and new power structures, but a reimagining of how family and business could interact productively in a complex global enterprise. Patricia recovered first, her expression betraying the calculation behind her measured response. This represents a significant departure from traditional family governance across generations of Westbrooks. As does the global shipping environment we now navigate, I countered. The question isn't whether change is necessary, it's whether we direct that change purposefully or resist until circumstances force our hand. Robert studied the displayed model with the careful attention of someone evaluating a complex chess position. This provides no guaranteed family authority over major decisions. Everything is advisory or contributory rather than controlling. Authority without expertise is increasingly unsustainable, I responded. The model preserves influence proportional to actual contribution, which should be our standard regardless of last name. The discussion that followed revealed the true divisions within the family more clearly than any previous interaction. Some members embraced the opportunity for meaningful engagement aligned with their interests and abilities. Others remained fixated on control mechanisms, unable to separate family identity from governance authority. A few simply wanted financial returns without operational involvement, their primary concern being dividend stability rather than governance structure. Throughout the conversation, I maintained focus on a simple principle: respect for legitimate expertise regardless of source, whether family-derived or professionally developed. This standard applied equally to my own authority, earned through demonstrated results rather than merely inherited position. Ultimately, I concluded as the discussion reached natural conclusion, this isn't about choosing between family legacy and organizational effectiveness. It's about redefining legacy itself, from control maintained to value created, from position inherited to contribution earned. As family members departed, their varying reactions reflecting the spectrum of acceptance, resistance, and calculation that would shape coming months, Elizabeth lingered behind. She approached once the room had cleared, her expression thoughtful. "You've fundamentally changed the conversation," she observed. "Not just about who makes decisions, but about what family contribution actually means." "It was time," I replied. "The company outgrew the governance model generations ago. Grandfather saw it but couldn't bring himself to dismantle what previous generations had built. He left that task to someone with less emotional attachment to existing structures. And more vision for what could replace them, she added. I don't think everyone will accept this transition easily. Some identities are too invested in the old power structures. I don't expect universal acceptance, I acknowledged. Just enough recognition of reality to allow progress without constant obstruction. The results will ultimately speak more persuasively than any governance proposal. As we walked through the shipyard toward waiting cars, the contrast between past and future was visibly embodied in the vessels under construction, some representing traditional designs with incremental improvements, others incorporating revolutionary technologies that would redefine performance standards. Both would sail under the Westbrook flag, connecting heritage with innovation in tangible form. There's something I've been meaning to ask, Elizabeth said as we paused near the edge of the main construction dock. That first day at the funeral, when they relegated you to the back row and excluded you from speaking, did you know then what grandfather had planned? Did you already understand you would inherit everything? I considered the question carefully, remembering the isolation of that day, the practiced invisibility I had maintained while family members performed their public grief without acknowledging mine. No, I answered honestly. I had no idea what was coming. I was there simply because he was my grandfather and I loved him, despite everything the family had constructed around us. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about inheritance or position, just saying goodbye to someone who had seen me when everyone else had trained themselves to look past me. Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding registering in her expression. That's what Robert and Patricia still don't comprehend. They think this is about power. Who has it? Who wants it? Who lost it? But for you, it's always been about something more fundamental. Recognition, I confirmed. Not just of me personally, but of contribution regardless of source, of value beyond traditional measures, of potential in unexpected places. I gestured toward the innovative vessels taking shape. Before us, the same recognition that sees possibility where others see only deviation from established patterns. The setting sun cast long shadows across the shipyard, silhouetting cranes and scaffolding against the darkening sky. Workers changed shifts. Around us, the day crew departing as night teams arrived to continue progress under floodlights, the continuous forward movement that defined not just shipbuilding, but organizational evolution itself. Grandfather's final choice wasn't about favoring one family member over others, I reflected. It was about choosing organizational future over family past. The company needed leadership that could navigate a changing world without being anchored to outdated governance. He found that potential in the family member who had been forced to develop perspective from the margins rather than the center. As we finally turned toward our vehicles, Elizabeth paused once more. Do you think the family will ever truly accept the new direction? I considered the complexity of that question, the intertwined threads of personal identity, generational legacy, and resistance to change that defined the Westbrook dynamic. Some already have, some never will. Many will align with success once it's undeniable, claiming they supported the vision all along. That's the nature of organizational transformation. It's judged by outcomes, not intentions. The truth of this assessment settled between us as we prepared to depart, Elizabeth returning to headquarters to continue her modernization initiatives, myself to the estate, to prepare for upcoming international negotiations. Different paths now aligned toward shared purpose rather than family obligation. As I drove away from the shipyard where Westbrook shipping had begun generations earlier, I reflected on the journey from excluded family member to transformational leader. The path hadn't been chosen or sought. It had been thrust upon me through my grandfather's final decision to prioritize organizational future over family tradition. Yet in that unexpected inheritance lay a profound opportunity. Not simply to claim rightful position, but to redefine what leadership itself could mean when liberated from constraints of precedent and privilege. The company emerging from this transition wouldn't simply be a continuation of what came before, but an evolution that honored heritage while embracing potential previously untapped. In the fading light of the shipyard, among the vessels that would carry our name across global waters, I had glimpsed what grandfather must have seen when making his controversial choice. Not just a granddaughter deserving recognition, but a future requiring new navigation. The greatest inheritance wasn't the company itself, but the opportunity to chart its course toward horizons previous generations could only imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.